Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Hi, Laura. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We're so glad you're joining us for the last part. Um, the last part of our learning series. Sorry, I just got a notice someone wants to do AI notes. Please feel free. And we're really grateful to have you all here. We know this is a question that is on many people's minds. And so to kick off, we will be engaging in the question, should we say democracy? This may be a question that you have been wrestling with. We know many people, often sometimes in a hallway in a whisper, ask us, so should I say democracy? So we're going to say the quiet parts out loud here today. And really help with some of the data from our Civic Language Perception Project along the way. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Amy McIsaac. I am the Managing Director of Learning and Experimentation at PACE. Many of you have been along this learning journey with us. This is the fifth of a five-part learning series of our civic language research. But for those of you who are new to us and kind of intrigued by this particular topic, just to introduce our organization's work, we are a philanthropic laboratory, and we have about close to 80 members who are all funders in some regard. The thing that they have all in common is that they are in some way maximizing their impact on American democracy and civic life. They do that from a variety of ways, and the work that we do is sorry, I'm getting another AI companion piece. There we go. The work that we do is really what our members need, and what we know in the field will help enhance our members' work. We've been around for about 20 years, and for about 5 of those years, we've been on a journey of learning about civic language perceptions of Americans, and it's a very unique topic to spend energy on, and you might wonder why. The real reason is because we've been hearing mostly from our members, but really broadly in the field at large, that the coded and loaded nature of civic terms has become untenable. And the question that comes to us often is, are there even words I can say anymore? And so we took a bite of that apple in 2019, and surveyed Americans at a very high level and realized there was so much more interest and so much work to do that we did another round of research in 2021 and then another round of research in 2023, which is what we'll be animating and informing the analysis we'll look at today. To give you some context in where you're meeting us in our research journey in this round, we actually designed this survey last fall, and it was in the field in November of 2023. We released our data, you can get it on our website, in March of 2024, earlier this year. And then for the last 6 months, we've really been in what I'm calling a flurry of learning and activity. This is, again, the 5th learning series we did, but we were hosting conversations on what to say to Gen Z, should we say patriotism, different cuts of our data. We have been on the road, kind of presenting at least once a week, sometimes more often than that. And what that's given us is an opportunity to go into our data with different inquiries and try to understand it more deeply. So we've been in a bit of a flurry for the last 6 months, and we're kind of at the tail end of that. And we started a process of really distilling what we think we now know and what sense we now make from all of that learning and activity into something that feels a little bit more like a report, which we plan to be putting out in September. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and we'll share more at the end. So let me tell you a little bit more about the survey instrument itself, and then we'll get into the analysis that we'll look at today. So this was a nationally representative sample of 5,000 registered US voters that were surveyed in November of 2023. And we worked with Citizen Data, who many of you may know, to both design and field the survey. What I want you to know as we go through this data is that these were registered US voters. That was a design choice we made, frankly, so that we could do some comparable analysis with previous versions of our data where we made those choices then. I won't get into the nuances here, but just do know as we look at the research that we are looking at respondents who are registered US voters. Now, most Americans are registered to vote in the United States. And so we know we're getting a pretty good pulse of where Americans are overall, but not a complete picture. And we want to acknowledge that from the top. In the purple box here, you see the 21 terms that we surveyed in this round of research. If a term is bolded, it is because we also tested it in 2021. So those are the words that we have the ability to look at any sort of increase or decrease in perceptions over the 2 years. So we'll be looking at a little bit of that. The other thing to note is that for obvious reasons, if you've ever taken a survey, we did not ask all respondents to give us their impressions of all 21 words. Instead, we clustered the words into 3 groups of 7, and we tried our best to thematically categorize them. So that's what you're seeing here is the way that we clustered these words so that our respondents were really engaging deeply on 7 each. On the bottom side of this slide, I just want you to let it kind of wash over your eyes. These are the different demographic categories that we captured from respondents. So these, again, are ways that we can cut into the data and really enrich our learning. If it's bolded, again, we captured it in 2021 and recaptured in 2023. Not bolded, those are some new cuts that we were able to make happen this year. So the last piece of context I want to give you is what was in the survey, like what were we trying to understand? So the survey was 49 questions, and there's really 6 things we were trying to understand. At the top of this wheel, highest level, we were trying to understand Americans' impressions of these words. Are they positive, negative, neutral, or unfamiliar? Really, we designed this survey, though, because we feel like we were understanding something about impressions the last time we did this research. We wanted to understand why people hold the impressions they do of the term. That is really where we put a lot of our energy in this survey. So we asked people to tell us their most positive word. We forced a choice there, and then they were given some options about why they feel positive about that word. And similarly on the negative side, which is your most negative word, and then some options for why. So we'll look into some of that data as we go. And then there are 3 areas that we were trying to understand Americans' relationships to these words. So first, does this word motivate you to do anything? For some folks, they were asked if this word motivates them to vote. Some folks help in a community. Some folks stand up for a cause. We were trying to understand the degree to which people felt like a term was meant for them or meant for someone else. And they're really trying to understand how Americans feel in terms of ownership of these terms. So that was a very rich data set for us. And then maybe very top of mind for folks on this call, do you perceive this word to be bringing people together or driving people apart? So what is the unifying potential of this word in these terms as Americans perceive it? So this is the universe of information we have. We also did have one definitional question, which we'll get into pretty significantly later. And that is the world that we had captured from respondents. So with all that context now, what we'd love to do is a little warm up. It helps all of us kind of flex our brain a little bit and not go in and pull a muscle as we go through the analysis. So what I want to do first, if you want to pull up your chat, I will try to keep an eye on it. I'm famously not good at multitasking this way. I'm not a very tech-equipped millennial, but here we go. So I'd love to hear in the chat, what percentage, take a guess, what percentage of respondents in our survey told us they were positive on the term democracy? So somewhere between 0 and 100%. What would be your guess? I'm seeing 60%, 55%, 36%. I'm seeing some in the 70s, but some in that 50, 40, 30. Okay, I'm seeing a big spread here. All right, well, some of you will be surprised. Some of you will be validated. We had 70%. 70% of Americans overall that took our survey told us that of the 4 options available to them, positive, negative, neutral, unfamiliar, they selected positive. That was not a select all that apply question. They had to pick one, and they picked positive. Let's go to the next question. Same sort of vibe here. Tell me what percentage you think of our survey respondents told us they were unfamiliar with the word democracy. They had not heard it before. Unfamiliar. I'm seeing some 5s, some 10s, some 12s. So far, I'm not seeing it. Okay, the number is 1. 1% of our respondents told us they had never heard the word democracy before. They were completely unfamiliar with it. So I'm going to make a massive assumption that most people on this call are here because you work in the civic space somewhere. You're doing a great job. People know about the word democracy. Very high familiarity on this term across our respondents. Okay, last question. These are the different age categories. Which age group do you think was most positive on the term democracy? Go ahead and pop that in to the chat and show me what guess you got. Seeing older Americans at 135 to 44. Okay, so we're running the gamut here as well, but kind of seeing that middle age probably as a contender. Very good. Most of you were in the right neighborhood here. So 65 to 74 was the highest percentage positive group at 84%. We do see, if you look at these numbers quickly, the older Americans were more positive than the younger Americans. But 57% of Gen Z being positive on the term democracy, I think, is very encouraging and exciting to see as well. So while it's not as high as some of the other ones, I think I'm seeing just good news when I look across these numbers. Great. So we're stretched out, we're warmed up. Let's look at what we're going to cover today. So where we want to start is what stands out to us about the word democracy. And one of the good news about you guys coming to the 5th webinar of this series is that we have looked at over 400 cuts of the data. And pretty much every time we do, no matter what we're looking for or what we're trying to understand, we always take an extra look to see where democracy is. And so we've just had a lot of the word democracy washing over us for 6 months. So we're going to share some of the things that are rising to the top for us here. So to start, we just looked at this in the warm-up. American voters are overwhelmingly positive on democracy. If we look to this pie chart on the left, we see that basic breakdown of impressions across the 4 options across all of our respondents. 70% positive, 20% neutral, 9% negative, and that 1% unfamiliar. This is really exciting to me. 70% positive and 20% meh. That's 90% of Americans being open to the word democracy in some degree of intensity. I'm here for it. I really think that's a positive graphic for us. On the right side of this slide, we see where democracy falls in the list of all the terms we tested. These terms are ranked from most positive to least positive. That's that purple bar. Again, we see orange in the negative in the orange, unfamiliar in the yellow, and neutrality in the gray. And so you see democracy at the middle point on positivity. It's in the top third of negativity. So if you're just zeroing in on that orange line, you see it is one of the ones that is over to the left more than others. It is very low on familiarity, as we talked about earlier, but even comparatively to some of the other terms, people know the term democracy. They're telling us they know this term. And then it's about middle of the road on neutrality compared to the other terms as well. Instead of showing you a bunch of slides of the different demographic cuts of all of these impressions, we did the due diligence. And what we wanted to share here is that there were some demographics that were skewing the positivity more than others. So male respondents were more positive than females. Asian and white Americans were more positive than other groups. We saw liberals and Democrats telling us they were more positive on the term than conservative and Republicans. And as we kind of discussed and saw in the warm-up, older Americans, especially those over 55, were more positive on the term democracy than younger Americans, particularly those under 44. Each of these were at least a 10 percentage point difference. So we are talking about a meaningful difference in positivity. And the older and younger spread was actually closer to 30 percentage points. So that's kind of where the positivity was trending. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the most positive word and the most negative word. So again, we were asking people to force select one word. And so we were curious how many times when they had to select one, did they select democracy? And again, they weren't seeing all 21 words at a time. Respondents were seeing 7 at a time. So when we just zero in on our democracy cluster in this top graphic, we see that democracy was picked 17% of the time as the most positive word, and about 27% of the time as the most negative word. Now, I also mentioned earlier when we were giving context that when they selected their most positive and their most negative, they were given options for why they felt that way. And what's important to note is that they were given inverse options. So on the positive side, if this word makes me feel hopeful about the future, on the negative side, this word makes me feel fearful about the future. This word aligns with my personal values. This word does not align with my personal values. And so when we look at that at the bottom graph here, we see that for the people who chose democracy as their most positive word, it was because they felt like it made them feel hopeful about the future and it was aligned with their personal values. For the folks who said democracy is my most negative word of the options I see, it was because it was making them feel fearful about the future. And really interestingly, it was the way politicians were portraying this term in a negative light. So this is not dissimilar for how we saw Americans. If you've been on this learning journey with us before, this is a similar story to how Americans were telling us they felt positive or negative about any of the terms. But we see it playing out here for democracy too. It does seem like there is an external factor to the way a term like democracy is being shaped by politicians, and not to be outdone by the way the media is portraying the word democracy, that is influencing a negative relationship for Americans. Whereas on the positive side, it's much more of an internal connection that they are feeling for why they are positive on the term democracy. So last thing I'm going to show you is some of the increase. Again, we captured 11 words in 2021 that we retested again in 2023. If you've been with us on this journey, you know that we were very surprised to see overall increases in 2 years in net positivity on these words. I think we thought we would see hold steady, if not some decreases. We only saw hold steady at unity and diversity. They're within or close to the margin of error. Everything else we saw an increase in. So, a word like liberty in 2 years got 20 percentage points more positive. It's really interesting to us. But if we zero in on the word democracy, we see that overall that word got almost 8 percentage points. So it's 7.8 percentage points more positive in 2 years. And the first question that comes to my mind is, that's interesting, but were there certain groups that were driving that more than others? And the answer when we looked into the data was yes. Some of the groups that were driving democracy's increase in 2 years were Black and African Americans, 18 to 34-year-olds, and nonpartisan and independents. Now, this is particularly an interesting finding for us because 2 slides ago, we just showed you that older white liberal Democrats were the people who are most positive on this board. We're seeing different groups here getting more positive in the 2 years. So this signals to us that there is a more rapid increase in particular groups that are different than the folks who are already demonstrating positivity, and that feels hopeful for us. So we're going to pause after we go through 2 sections for questions and comments. So I'm right now going to pass it over to my colleague, Siri, who's going to talk about some of the ways that democracy and republic might be worth looking into, which I know has been a very hot topic for many. So Siri, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So before we even created our survey this time, we did a socialization process, talked to a lot of partners in philanthropy and in the civic field about language trends that they were seeing and really curious about. And one of the reoccurring themes was this curiosity about democracy versus republic. Are some people more preferential to one or the other? What trends are we seeing there? Are some people using republic as a stand-in for democracy? What is the relationship? So we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into a few slides looking at these 2 terms specifically. You may have seen this conversation playing out in the paper. Here's some of the headlines. You might also have been in this conversation with some of your colleagues. So let's take a look at what our data say. So first, we wanted to do a cut by different demographic groups. What we found, probably not surprisingly, is that the biggest differences in these 2 terms happened by political identity. So what you're looking at here are political ideology on the top graphic and political party on the lower graphic. There are a lot of interesting things here, and I'll let you kind of take it in while I give some voiceover to a few of the things that really stood out for me. So first, if we look at political ideology, let's take a look at that top coupling of bars. What do very liberal people think about these 2 terms? And here we see in that group, 81% are positive on the term democracy, and only 36% are positive on the term republic. So there's a 45 percentage point difference between these two terms in the minds of people who identify as very liberal. If we go down then to very conservative, you can see somewhat of an opposite pattern, but the gap is not nearly as big. So people who identify as very conservative are more positive on the term republic than they are on the term democracy, but the difference is only 14 points. So there's a much bigger gap on these two terms in the minds of people who are identifying as very liberal and somewhat liberal than very conservative. Interestingly, moderates follow a little bit more of the pattern of liberals, but also what's very interesting in that top graphic is somewhat conservatives who have an equal positivity for both terms, although they are slightly more negative on the term democracy than they are on republic. So a lot of interesting trends that perhaps validate some of the things that you've been seeing play out in news media, in coverage of political campaigns, or maybe even observing with people in your own organizations or with grantee partners and community partners that you're working with. So these two terms are definitely landing differently for people depending on their political ideology. The lower graphic is by political party, and there we see a similar set of trends. And so I'm not going to spend as much time on that one, but you can see there's kind of a parallel story happening there. We don't see any party identity that has that equal positivity for Republican democracy like we did in the somewhat conservative comparison. But nevertheless, we see that general overall trend that people who identify as Democrats or lean Democrats are much more positive, significantly more positive on the term democracy than they are on the term republic, whereas Republicans and lean Republicans are slightly more positive on the term republic than they are on the term democracy. Now, I'm not going to speculate too much on the reasons for this. That could maybe be the topic for a whole nother webinar. But our data do seem to be validating what others have been just kind of observationally writing about or talking about in their circles. So let's take a look at the next slide, which brings us back to that forced choice of most positive and most negative. And if we just zero in on the two terms of interest here in this section, democracy and republic, what we see is that there's many, many, many more people who selected democracy as their most positive term. Republic had the fewest number of people selecting that term out of this cluster as their most positive. However, when we look at most negative, that's a different story. So republic was actually the number one vote getter for most negative, and democracy was number two. So those two terms were together making up the bulk of the most negative choices on this question. We also wanted to do a deeper dive on why. So what might be the reasons underneath those selections? So here we are looking specifically at the reasons people gave for choosing democracy as either their most positive or negative term by political ideology. And so here again, you see those categories that we looked at earlier, very liberal, somewhat liberal, moderate, somewhat conservative, and very conservative. The purple are the reasons that people gave for selecting it as their most positive term. On the orange side, those are the reasons that people gave for selecting it as their most negative. Some really interesting things here that I wanted to point out. In general, though, what we see for the term democracy is following kind of the overall dominant reasons that people gave for choosing any term as most positive or most negative. So the bulk of people, everyone except those who identify as very conservative, said that their top two reasons for choosing democracy as their most positive term are that it made them feel hopeful about the future and that it aligned with their personal values. The only outlier are those who identified as very conservative. For them, if they chose democracy as their most positive term, they said they did so because politicians were speaking positively about the term and it made them think of people that they like. If we look at the reasons people gave for saying this was their most negative term, here we see some trends, but also some distinctions by political identity. So on the negative side, the top reason that people who are very liberal said that they chose it as their most negative term was that they lacked confidence using the term, which I think is really interesting. It's kind of an outlier in that set. Then we had somewhat liberal, moderate, and somewhat conservative, all giving their top reason as politicians portrayed the term in a negative light. And very conservatives said, yes, politicians portraying it in a negative light, but also really high on it made them feel fearful about the future. So very interesting data there. Now let's take a deeper dive into a similar look, except this time for the term republic. So for the term republic, again, the purple side are the reasons why people said this was their most positive term, which we know the N on that was very small for all of these. So take this with somewhat of a grain of salt. But in general, for all of our groups here, it either was about, it made them feel hopeful for the future or it aligned with their personal values. Where we see greater distinctions is actually on the negative side. And we had a lot more N there. So a lot more people selected it as their most negative term. And so that might be giving us a little bit better data from a statistical standpoint, but interesting differences on the negative side. So very liberal people who selected republic as their most negative term said they did so because it reminds them of people they don't like. Very interesting. Somewhat liberal and moderate said it was because politicians are portraying the term in a negative light. And then conservatives, both somewhat and very, said that republic was their most negative term because they lacked confidence using the term. That was the highest choice there. So some really interesting differences in reasons why people are perceiving these terms both positively and negatively. Now we are going to pause and see if you have any reflections or reactions that you would like to share. And so you can do that by raising your hand with the reactions button, or if you want to post something in the chat, you can do that too. But does anybody have something specifically that you would like to give voice to? Deborah, I'm seeing your hand.
Hi, thank you. This is Deborah Humphreys at Limited Foundation. I actually just had a question about two different slides, and I think I was confused about them measuring different things. So there was the one slide early about how 70% positive for democracy. Like you heard the term 70% positive. But then when you did the really interesting like comparison from 2021 to 2023, democracy went from 53 to 61. So I was confused why it didn't go from 53 to 70.
Yeah, we're looking at different things here. So we're looking at positivity with the 70, and this is net positivity. So it's positivity minus the
I see.
The negativity. Yeah, so that's where you get to the 61 because we had 70 minus 9.
I got it. Okay, got it.
Yep. So slightly different things, but very, very good catch.
Yeah.
Paying
Okay,
attention.
Cool. Okay, cool. That's the difference. Got it.
Yeah, great clarifying question. Probably helped others too. Ashley, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Lovely presentation. I was curious about whether or not you all also compared confidence in using these terms over time, and whether or not there have been like overall changes in confidence using the term democracy.
That's a great question. We did not have those sets of questions in our last two surveys. And so it's a new question this time around. So we unfortunately do not have that comparative data. Great question though.
And I'll tag on just to say, Ashley, we're also on our like dream list of analysis. So our data team is like, I've done 400 graphs. We would love to understand more about this confidence question and like almost like what would a confidence index in this language data look like? Because I think one of the things when we have presented this over the last many months, people zero in on that because it feels solvable, right? Like, I really don't know if I can do much about your personal feelings aligning with this, but I feel like I might be able to help on confidence. So I feel like there's something there for us to kind of go a little bit deeper into the research. We'll see if we end up getting to it before we wrap up, but I think a world of learning there is just waiting for us.
Great. Well, thank you for those questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Amy to take us into a really, really like hot set of content on what different Americans said were their definitions of democracy. So over to you, Amy.
Thanks. I feel like I have like gossip to share in this next section. So, we, like I said, there was a question 49. It's the last question, going through the survey. It's the last one they saw. And respondents were given one of 3 words, depending on which cluster they were kind of traveling with throughout the survey. So for example, they either got the word democracy, civic engagement, or racial equity. So let's just look at the folks who got democracy. Question 49 read, democracy can be defined in several different ways. In a few words, please describe how you understand it. So about, again, a third of our sample set got it. So we have a universe of 1,688 write-in definitions from Americans on how they define democracy. I've read through them. I've seen the best of humanity. I've seen the worst of humanity, but there is a lot to dig into. 156 words was the longest definition we had. There was quite a few people who did it in one word. Usually that word was some version of freedom, rights. A lot of people wrote good, which I thought was interesting and positive. On average, it took our respondents 11 words to define the word democracy. Now, this is where I'm going to take a slight aside and get on a little soapbox about how much pressure we're putting on this little word democracy. This word democracy and really all of the words in our survey, we've been really sitting over the last couple months with how hard it is to be a word in our civic lives right now and how much we're asking these words to represent full life experiences, full value systems, full belief systems. And Americans are telling us in order to describe this word democracy, they need this many words. And we just want to sit with that because we're going to get into a place later in this presentation about how to talk bridgier about democracy. And I just want to put an early plug in. One of the ways you talk bridgier about democracy is you talk. And you use more words and you explain yourself a little bit more. And I think all the efforts that many of you are out there doing, and a lot of our members and colleagues are doing around dialogue and around bridging through conversation, I think that's major ingredient that needs to be continued. And that's a big part of what our data reinforces. But let's go into the actual definitions. And at the highest level, what I want to show you is just the hot take on how American voters are telling us they understand democracy. So this is what shows up in their definitions. There's a lot about government by the people, a lot around powers derived from the people. That is a very clear theme that emerges. Equal representation and rights. So a lot coming at us on equal rights to vote, express opinions, and to participate. We see a good amount around freedom and autonomy. So freedom of speech, freedom from oppression, freedom to live freely. Also, when I was looking at this analysis, I was like, no wonder the word freedom is our top ranked word. It's very, very positive, but it's like the 1 or 2 words after that change the whole game. So you see that play out here. But freedom and autonomy was showing up a lot in the definitions of democracy. We see elections. So we're getting a little more into the mechanics of things showing up in these definitions. Elections themselves named, the ability for citizens to choose leaders and influence governmental decisions. We saw themes around accountability. So leaders are accountable to the people. There was a lot of flavor around the way that people must govern ethically and not serve their interests. So talking about elected officials there and holding them accountable. And then elements and themes around inclusivity. So definitions, we're talking about how democracy allows various voices and viewpoints to be heard. One person said even the average person has a say. So that is kind of the pillars of the definitions that were written in for us to analyze. But where I want to spend some time, and sorry, this is getting a little buggy here. We went in and we compared some groups because we were like, okay, it feels like maybe we're having different conversations, and that might be behind this question. Should we say democracy? It's like I'm saying it in one room and it's going one way, and I'm saying another room is going another way. So can we get into the definitions and understand something? So where we're going to start here, we're going to look at 3 versions of comparison. First, we're going to look at political ideology. We took all the respondents who wrote in a definition of democracy and self-identified as either very or somewhat liberal, and we looked at their definitions, and then the same for somewhat and very conservative. And here's what we see across those definitional patterns. So in both situations, there was an expressed democracy was valued, and that was clear in the definitions across these 2 groups that we subdivided. On the liberal side of things, democracy was really defined as equality, inclusivity, social justice. On the conservative side of things, terms like individual rights, limited government, personal freedoms, that was more of the flavor on the conservative side. In the center, we also see a similarity in that both groups were talking about there being a role of government in democracy. On the liberal side, it was positioned more as a tool for social justice and equality. And on the conservative side, we were hearing it talked more about as thinking about limiting government and really allowing for individual liberties. And then make no mistake, there were a lot of critiques in these definitions. And on the liberal side of things, the critiques were really around the way that democracy is presenting lack of representation and inequalities. And on the conservative side, we were hearing more about government overreach and the loss of individual freedoms. So this is just a kind of breakdown of what we saw as different things emerging in the 2 groups of definitions. I'm going to guess a lot of this tracks to what you already know and some of your experiences, and where I wanted to just use this as a primer to go into. I don't know that we've ever really thought about, I know at PACE we haven't really thought too deeply about how do different racial groups define democracy and what are the differences there. And so we went ahead and made 4 subgroups in the definitions by these 4 racial groups. Of course, there are many more, but these were the 4 we kind of held up to take a look at side by side. In the middle, we see some themes in those definitions that were consistent across all of these groups. So freedom came up a lot, the right to vote came up a lot, equality and equal rights, representation and participation, and then there was a healthy dose of skepticism and disillusionment popping up in these definitions as well. But let's go around the horn here and just do a quick rundown of what we saw as nuances and differences. So in the group of respondents who identify as Hispanic, Latino, or Latina, we saw that there was more emphasis on equality and coming together for the common good. Common good was an ideal that was talked about a lot here. Also, freedom was very present in these definitions. I think there's probably another sub-analysis to be like, okay, but what freedom? What are we talking about when we say freedom? But freedom was coming up a lot in these definitions. And then the skepticism for this group was really coming in the shape of democracy in practice is not representative. So there was a real distinction between democracy as a term, as a concept, as an ideal, and what I'm experiencing right now. And that's where the skepticism for this group was coming in as feeling it's not representative. Over on the top right side, we did some analysis of the group of folks who identify as Black or African American. And there we see a little bit more emphasis on social equality in the definitions of democracy. We see a little bit more stressing of the need for representation and fairness. Fairness was the distinction here I want you to hear because it's the one we saw as different here. And then skepticism here was really deriving from, again, democracy in practice is not inclusive, which is a little different than representative. Obviously, there's some similar threads there, but their skepticism was really coming from a place of democracy in practice, as I experience it, is not inclusive. Going to the bottom left, the group that identify as Asian American, we heard a lot of highlighting about the importance of fair elections in these definitions, which I think is interesting, and kind of related the emphasis on participation and citizen engagement. I think in this group, we saw the largest range of varied perceptions and perspectives. We saw folks who were very positive on it. We saw folks who were very critical on it. I think there was a lot of variance in this particular group. And then in the bottom right-hand corner here, we look at the folks who identify as white in this breakdown. And here something different was happening. We're seeing a slightly different story here. In these definitions of democracy, there is way more presence around historical and constitutional details. That was very present in the definitions. There was a lot of importance placed on systems and structures of government. The word constitution was mentioned quite a bit. And again, there was skepticism here, but it was really being derived from and being named around corruption, which is a different skepticism than some of the other skepticism that was emerging in the other definitions. So again, some similarities, but some nuances here in how folks are defining democracy that might get us a little bit closer to understanding where we might be missing each other when we say the word democracy. So the last comparison I wanted to do was, all right, we had a whole bunch of people who told us they liked democracy and a whole bunch of people who told us they didn't like democracy. Well, how are they defining it and what's different there? And so again, about 70% of our folks were positive and 9% were negative. So we do see a different N here, but based on what we wrote in, overall, people who are positive on democracy, across the board, we saw they were defining it as democracy protects freedoms and rights. You can see on the positive side, the right to vote, freedom of speech, independence from government control. On the negative side, and you'll see this is a bit of a pattern in what I'm about to go over, they saw the intent, but they didn't see it being practiced. And instead, what they were experiencing was democracy as a tool for government control. They both were defining democracy as ensuring equality and inclusivity. On the positive side, all people have equal voice regardless of background was a theme that emerged. On the negative side, people really saw it as, I think it ensures equality and inclusivity, but I'm experiencing it as only serving a select few. And then in both groups' definitions, there was an importance of the people that really emerged. You really heard a lot about the people. On the positive side, it was talked about in ways that power was derived from the people, elected officials are accountable to the people. On the negative side, we were hearing from folks that democracy is failing to serve the people and instead is benefiting the wealthy and politicians. One thing that really stuck out to us when we looked at these definitions is that on the positive side, there was very little talk of political parties. There was a lot more focus on democracy principles. On the negative side, political parties were named. And we saw that as a pretty clear difference. We can see the way, depending on if people are positive or negative, the presence of partisanship in their definitions. So let's see how we're doing on time. We're doing great. Okay, so we're going to use this last chunk of time to give you some tools because we know we just walked you through a whole bunch of data about democracy itself, and should we say democracy was the question that brought us all here today. So we're going to try to answer that question for you. But spoiler alert, there's not really an answer to that question. Should you say democracy is a question you have to answer for yourself and what you're trying to achieve and the work that you're trying to do. But what we do have is a tool that we've been leaning on heavily in this program that we want to kind of open up and offer for you to kind of walk through with us and see how it might be valuable to you. So let me just explain the platform real quick, and then we have some folks who we did an exercise with that are excited to share some of what has helped them. So Pluralytics is an AI tool that we've partnered with in the last couple months. And what I love about this platform, if you don't already know about it, mostly works with corporations, and we've been working with them in kind of the social space, is their whole philosophy is let's not let words get in the way of our meaning. So there's just a lot of different ways to say something. They always use the example of you can ask someone to donate, you can ask someone to give to your cause, you can ask someone to contribute. Pretty much the same thing I'm trying to get you to do. It's just that different words are going to fall on different people's ears in different ways. And so they have this whole language science and their whole data ocean of analysis, and they've broken it down into 5 value voices. I won't get into the the kind of inner workings of that. But you can see in the top right corner here, this is like an example of the way that they break down their different value voices. What you need to know is that the platform itself, you can input any piece of content. It'll read any piece of content. Then it'll score it against who that content is reaching, similar to that graph at the top there. And then it'll suggest a rewrite to improve the engagement. So if I'm trying to get a little bit more into some of those categories, these are based on consumer and audience profiles and values, it'll rewrite so that you get higher on that score. So again, I won't get into the inner workings for the context here. We can bring you along if you're interested in learning more. But we co-designed 5 benchmarks with Pluralytics throughout this project. And really, we've been leaning on them to say, does this content help me get to this group? And the ones that we designed with them was Gen Z. Does this help me get to Gen Z? Rural communities, again, another community we know many of our members and our colleagues are thinking about in this election year. And then Bridgie, we are really going in on this Bridgie concept, but is there a way that we can talk that we can be bridgy in our language by politics, be bridgy in our language by racial groups, and be bridgy in our language by age? The race and the age are in beta form right now. We've been playing around with it, but we've been spending a lot of time on bridgy by politics. So if I put this content in and I ask it to hit a bridgy by politics benchmark, does it? And if not, can you rewrite it so it does? So this is the journey we've been on and the tool we use. And about a week ago, I sent an email out to the folks who had registered for this up to that point and said, would anyone like us to run your content through this and see if it hits for Bridgie by politics? And if not, offer some rewrites and we can learn together what's working. And we had 2 people, we had a lot of people raise their hand. So I want to thank you all who are interested, and we've been following up with folks individually. But the 2 folks who we did an exercise with to learn together, I wanted to give them a little bit of time to share that exercise. So to start, I'd love to invite Maria Perez to come off mute. She's at Democracy Rising and been a partner of ours for the last many years. Maria, I'd love for you at a very, very high level to just introduce yourself and the work that you do to this group.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Amy. And hi, everyone. My name is Maria Perez. I am co-executive director of Democracy Rising. We are a very tiny but mighty national organization. We support jurisdictions when they're implementing electoral reforms to make sure that voters understand what's going on, that candidates understand what the changes are. So we do a lot of work with folks implementing ranked choice voting, proportional representation, open primaries, and so forth. And then we also actively build a new bench of democracy leaders from folks that we meet doing that work across the country.
Awesome. If you don't know Maria's work, you should. They do tremendous work. Maria, can you, what was going through your head when I said, does anybody want to run this through? Why did you want to do this exercise with your content?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if this was a good reason, but I reached out to you all anyways. But a few months ago, we started getting reporters from Arizona started reaching out to us, wanting our commentary because we, Democracy Rising, we're putting out these like really foul fascist billboards, political billboards supporting like fascist candidates in Arizona. And it was like really bad stuff, but it was like brought to you by We Are Democracy Rising. So folks were reaching out to us to get us to comment. And, it's like, we didn't do it. That's not us. We don't know who's doing it. It was a really scary time because it was just like so foul and our name was attached to it. We didn't know how to respond. Like we had to engage a legal team about it. Like it was just a bad thing. But what was clear to me is that if our name had been, like People Rising or, like Freedom Rising, maybe perhaps like the fact that democracy was in our name is what I'm pretty sure that it made these like, these bad actors, right? Like sort of like utilize our name to do their bad work.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate you sharing that because I think I am in a lot of conversations with folks who are like, should I just stop saying the word democracy, right? It seems like it's sending some signals and I don't know what that means. And I think your experience, it's not just an intellectual question, it's a safety and security question for some folks. And just really appreciate you sharing that. So what we did is we grabbed a piece of content from their website, and this is the content that we pulled out. I won't read it just to save time, but if you want to kind of glance through it, what I think is important to know, this is pulled right from their website. Democracy is used 6 times in this content, 2 times as part of their name, 4 times as just part of the sentence. And it did not score for bridginess by politics in its current form. And where it was missing was it was trending towards 2 value voices. It's Achiever Central and Global Me. Again, insider language that you can go on their website and get context on that. But those 2 value voices trend towards liberal consumer and liberal audiences. Where Democracy Rising language here was missing was a group called Hearth, tradition bearers. These are the conservative folks that are very traditional. Faith and family is a main part of how they think and talk and relate. And so what we asked this platform to do was, okay, take this exact language and let's get it higher on that Hearthy voice, and let's get it higher and closer to that benchmark where we're talking across the political spectrum. And so here's what we learned. We ran it through multiple times. So I'm not going to put all the different rewrites here, but what we gleaned from the rewrites are a couple lessons that we at PACE are taking. So one thing that I think is super important for this group to know is not in one rewrite did it eliminate the word democracy. It kept it in. And I think that's a really important lesson for us who are thinking about, should we say democracy, is it's not always just about that word. Again, we're putting a lot of pressure on that word. Sometimes it's about all the words that are around it and how you bring different values and signals through the other words and maintain a word like democracy. So just know you don't always have to just Control Alt Delete. There's other ways to navigate. So to get the Hearthy values voice into the content, these were some of the changes we saw smattered throughout the rewrites. It shifted from structural change to meaningful change. It shifted from democracy leaders to democracy advocates. It shifted from protect and enhance our democracy to support and reinforce our democratic values. So in some ways, this might just be like, okay, those are just like word choices. You can choose whatever you want. These are synonyms. True. And these words will hit differently for different people with different value systems. So this is where just having a little bit of knowledge on that is helpful about what will hit. And these are some of the changes it suggested. I think the other thing that we gleaned from this exercise with Democracy Rising and Maria is the biggest change came in this second sentence in all the rewrites. And this is the sentence I consider is like the real meat of what you guys wrote, Maria, because it's where you guys are describing democracy. You're kind of elaborating, extrapolating on democracy. And there are some consistent patterns in the rewrites that felt instructive to us. So for example, I think in every rewrite, it took out political equity and it shifted it to equal political representation. It shifted hold elected officials accountable to demand accountability. That's an interesting tone shift too. It shifted are fully able to participate meaningfully to can engage meaningfully. So keeping meaningfully, but shifting from participate to engage as a noted difference there. So I think a lot to dig into and a lot of like nuances to pay attention to, but this is like the level that I think it takes to really think about how our language is connecting to different types of folks. So I'll pause there. Maria, I'm just curious for your reflections after the exercise, if there's anything you felt like you learned or taking away, and also what questions are still sitting with you after the exercise we did earlier this week.
I mean, for me, the going through the exercise with you guys yesterday or a couple of days ago, whenever that was, like just how hard this is for humans to do, right? Because we have our own political biases, we have our ways of talking. So like we spend a lot of time wordsmithing this and like sort of like sharing with people, right? Like, is this what, does this align with our values, blah, 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 blah. All of that, yes. But then like just having this like AI tool that's like bada bing, bada boom. And then it's like a couple of really minor changes, right? Like I don't have any issue making any of these changes. Like I don't feel like my values or my organization's values are being diluted or like stretched in an uncomfortable place by any of these suggestions, right? So like just having a machine that doesn't have emotions, right, or biases in the same way that I do, just suggests some language. I think it's amazing. And what I asked you guys is like, can we just run our whole entire like website language through this AI tool? Because you know, we do want to be more bridgy, right? Like we're a nonpartisan organization. We really care about engaging everybody. So it's like, this is so helpful. And like we would have never gotten there as human beings.
Yeah, I think it really is a demonstration of like getting words out of the way of our meaning, like letting the meaning come through. Because yeah, this doesn't structurally change too much about the meaning you're communicating. It's just these little tweaks will help connect to an audience. If your goal is to bridge, now that is a major assumption we made in this exercise. We are interested in figuring out how to bridge more. And that may not be everyone's goal, but if you are, these are some of the tips and tricks that at least AI is suggesting and recommending. So Maria, I appreciate you letting us learn alongside of you. And with the last 5 minutes, I'd love to do a similar conversation with Laura Rogel, who's at Shift Family Foundation. So Laura, I'd invite you to come off mute and just introduce your work a little bit with the group.
Yeah, sure. I'll just briefly say we've convened what we're calling an action lab of practitioners from across 3 fields within the democracy landscape, as I put it: the bridging field, the community organizing field, and the kind of participatory democracy field. And so we have this cohort of practitioners from those 3 spaces that are interested in learning from each other's approaches and collaborating. And they've decided to do a pilot project together in a specific community of Parkersburg, West Virginia is what they landed on, where one of them has some connections. And so we'll be digging in more deeply together there over the coming year and a half.
Awesome. And Laura, what was on your mind for why this exercise was of interest?
I guess 2 things. I know I've heard, and even we've had some internal conversations, but also heard it broadly in the field of this question: do we say democracy? And then I think it's really coming to the fore as we're kicking off this pilot project in Parkersburg, seeing folks be inclined more, in some cases, towards civic engagement as something that's perhaps less polarizing as a term. So it is actively something we're talking about, of what language to use.
Yeah, I know it's on many's minds. Okay, so just to bring you guys into the exercise a little bit, here is the content that Laura had us run through. It is also off their website, and it is explaining their action lab. Democracy, as you see highlighted here, is used twice in this short blurb of content. It's really an explainer of the lab itself. And so again, we ran it through many times. It does not hit for political bridginess in the current form. Again, it was kind of missing that earthy voice. And so a lot of the rewrites were trying to optimize in that direction while not sacrificing on the more liberal voices that were already strong and present in the language. And so here's what we learned from this exercise with Shift Family Foundation. Very surprisingly to us, in 2 of the 3 rewrites that we looked at, it wanted us to get to democracy faster. So in this original context, we see that democracy is the last word of the first sentence. But in a few of the rewrites, it was actually trying to get democracy earlier into the content. So it went from, the Shift Action Lab as a collective, et cetera, to explore the world of democracy. And then another one, get involved in democracy. So that was just really interesting, again, for us, because it's not like we have to, again, remove democracy. And in the opposite direction, AI was actually telling us, get to it faster. And here are some ways to talk about it that'll also increase the value connection to that earthy voice. And so some of the ways that I noticed in this exercise, the earthy voice was coming through is where it dialed back some of the jargon. That's subjective, but some of the jargon that was in here. So it moved practitioners to professionals. Pretty much in every rewrite, it did not want to see siloed fields. So it took out typically siloed fields and moved it to something like traditionally separate sectors. And it moved language of desire to collaborate to something that was more like share a vision of working together. The other thing I want to note, this might be a little nuanced, but it was like sitting with me, so I'll share it, is that in the 3rd and final rewrite we had it do, the word democracy in that form was not present once, but democratic was present twice. And I've been sitting on that over the last couple of days, and I've been reflecting on the fact that in order to get the content more earthy, more open to the more conservative value voice, it was shifting democracy from a noun to an adjective and really allowing other principles to be the point of the message. So again, very nuanced, but subtle, but I think it's profound, possibly a lesson for us to take forward about how to talk about democracy in a more bridgy way. So for example, in the original content, we see learning and action on democracy, but switching the same line in the rewrite, it said democratic learning and advocacy, subtly shifting the kind of point to learning and advocacy instead of democracy, instead making it an adjective. And we see that play out again. Reimagine democracy for the 21st century in the last rewrite was shifted to enhancing democratic practices for the modern era. Again, democratic became an adjective to practices. So subtle, but I think interesting. Laura, after we did the exercise, what else is sitting with you, both from learnings and questions that still are present for you? Oh, you're on mute there, Laura.
Sorry, here. So grateful for this opportunity to work with you all on this. It was really great, and some helpful input on how to make our language more accessible to the kind of general public and in a more bridgy sense, which I very much appreciate. I think what's sitting with me is partly also looking at the data you all had shared, but very much fascinated that democracy was put kind of front and center in the rewrites still. And I think reflecting on the feedback from the skeptics of the term, that they were saying, oh, well, it's in theory, but not happening in practice, as a part of their critique. And so I'm just really appreciating that as an invitation for all of us to model what democracy can really mean in practice. And so we'll be thinking about that in our work in Parkersburg and beyond. So grateful.
Thanks, Laura. Really appreciate learning alongside you as well. I think we are just at time or even a minute over. So we're going to go straight to just letting you know how thankful we are that you came and learned alongside of us, whether you just came to this one or you've been with us for the whole series. If you are interested in getting to the data yourself, pacefunders.org/language. That's the front door to this whole project. You can get really everything you need there, including any data visualizations you are curious about. I'm going to guess we have it in the 400 or so that we've already done and we can get to you. So just let us know what you need to support your work. If you are interested in Pluralytics, we do have a partnership with them through the end of November. We designed it to hit through the end of the election season, more or less. And we can hook you up with some Pluralytics access if that's interesting. Just shoot us a note. And then share what you learned today on Twitter. Let us know what's hidden for you. And then my last kind of promo is that we are in the process of developing a resource, like I said, that'll be coming out in September. And the whole premise of this is real distilled guidance on how to talk bridgy. And so that's going to be the basis of the resource that we put out as a culminating part of this project. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. We'll probably get the notification when it's published just from being a registrant here. And we're just so thankful that you guys are learning with us and that you guys are as curious about if we should say democracy as Siri, I, and the rest of the PACE team is. So please lean on us if we can be a help in any other ways. And just thank you for coming, guys. Have a good rest of your day.